This was a hard pill to swallow, but I recently learned that I've been approaching lead guitar the wrong way for over 2 decades. Now, the good news is that it's really easy to fix. And before we fix this, you need to understand what the real problem is. For me, it started way back in the 90s when I first learned the minor pentatonic scale. And I got hooked right away. I got tons of mileage out of that single 2 notes per string position. But it also led me towards a way of thinking that was at the core of my problem for so many years. This problem kind of came to light once I got interested in more complex forms of music. I got into guitar because of hard rock bands, Guns N' Roses, Aerosmith, AC/DC, of course, all pentatonic driven bands. So anyways, I started developing a taste for, I guess, the jazzier side of music. Something like guys like Satriani, who's been a huge influence. He's the guy who kind of introduced me to those other sounds, and I discovered through Joe, the modes. And I delve into those new sounds with a new type of system. Instead of being a narrow system like the pentatonic scale, and by narrow I mean that you can access all the notes within a position without doing crazy extensions with your left hand, well, I approached those new types of scales, the modes, with the 3 note per string system, which allowed me to play all over the fretboard. And that opened a new door for me, the door of speed. And that's because those 3 note per strings give me more mileage out of a single string. I could play longer, faster on a single string, avoiding, well, the big problem, which on the guitar is going from one string to the other. And once I started playing that way with that system, things got worse for me. I mean, you would never know it by listening, because my playing was faster, it was fairly clean, and most people listening who are not guitar players wouldn't really recognize the fact that I was playing the same things over and over and over. It sounded kind of impressive, it sounded like what someone would think of a solo, and yet I knew that I was completely trapped. See, whenever I had to play over something, whether it was a backing track or with a band, I kind of saw whatever I was playing over as this landscape in the background, different chords, different rhythms, different parts of the song. But as long as I knew which scale to use, I could just cruise. And that's what I did. I was on automatic mode throughout the whole solo, regardless of the intricacy and the interesting things that were going on in the background. I was playing this way over the landscape. And I started to feel pretty bored with the guitar. I didn't feel like I was progressing the way that I had in the early days. I wasn't really learning anything new. All that I did was increase my speed, my accuracy, but my musicality completely flatlined. Everything changed. April 26th of 2006. A friend of mine wanted to go check out this new jazz club downtown Aix-en-Provence, France, where I grew up. So we show up at the Scat Club, grab a table, order some drinks, and on the stage, there was this guy playing his jazz guitar. I didn't really pay attention to him. It was kind of background music. Remember, at the time, I was not into jazz at all. I was just there for the drinks. But something caught my attention with that guy. See, he was alone on stage with his guitar, and what he was playing made so much sense to me. He was playing more of a lead type of way. A lot of single notes, single lines, licks, and yet I could still hear the chord progression without having to hear the chord progression in a traditional way. See, in my mind, a lead player could not really play lead without a backing track or a band playing the chords. Well, apparently not, and that guy proved it to me. So I started paying attention to what his fingers were doing, and I noticed that instead of playing horizontal like I was doing with my 3 note per string scales, the guy was pretty narrow on the fretboard. He wasn't doing these crazy extensions, and yet, like I said, I could hear so much movement in his music. And so I had to make a change, and that's exactly what I did. The very next day, I decided to get to work. The first thing I did was to grab my Donner Seeker Series DST-400 guitar, which I got on Amazon for only $259. I plugged into my amp thanks to the included cable. Next, I split the coil, which is one of my favorite tones on this particular guitar, and I made sure to leave the link in the description of this video if anyone wanted to check it out. I knew that in order to achieve what I heard the previous night, I needed to play in a narrow system. I also needed to play in a way that the chords could be brought up without needing to actually play those chords. And I also knew that I needed to keep things melodic. Now I started with a single chord, something super simple, something that I knew that I used a lot. I started with an A minor bar chord. My job was to play lead, but surround that chord, highlight the notes of the chords. And I started with just very simple notes of the chord, very boring, basically extracted the arpeggio from that chord, and then I started to embellish. And that's where things got really interesting. Because of my lack of music theory, I really did not know which notes would work on such chords. But I did have a special power, my ear. And so I started exploring. Because I knew I had to stay in a narrow position, that was very helpful. That eliminated all the outside notes, the notes that are too hard to reach. And string by string, I experimented with all the notes that were within reach. And I put each of these notes in a bucket. The sound good bucket, the sound bad bucket. So now I had a bunch of notes I could use to start developing that new way of playing. And I gave myself a lot of time to do that on that single chord. At first it sounded pretty clumsy, pretty uncomfortable, but eventually things started to become a little more musical, a little more natural on the guitar. But then I expanded to more complex chords. I basically just grabbed the chord book and any shape that was kind of different, I played. And I did that same exact exercise, making sure that I kept things in a narrow position, highlighted the notes of the chords, and kept things super melodic. Now that is such a different way of practicing that I had been doing for all these years. But it was also really fun and rewarding because I started reaping the rewards of those exploration games I gave myself. I eventually used that over simple chord progressions, things that I knew, like a blues chord progression and a 1-4-5. And man, that made such a difference in my playing. See, instead of playing my lead in a horizontal way, flat, against all the intricacy of the backing track, now I was playing with the backing track. Fully aware of those chords and those movements, painting over whatever was happening. And the crazy thing is that just by highlighting the chords, I also discovered some new ways of phrasing and developing. All right, enough talking. How about you and I try this together in this video?